In my previous video, I explained the importance of Oswald Spengler and how many modern scholars, unfortunately, underestimate Spengler, usually by misreading Spengler and thinking that he is the same as a modern historian or a modern scientist. And as I explained, Spengler is not trying to factually describe what happened in the past. Quite the opposite. He uses a language that is very broad, slightly poetic, slightly symbolic. Spengler is not your average modern political scientist or your average historian, and he's not to be taken strictly in terms of the literal words that he is using. Quite the opposite. He has a poetic tendency that should be taken into account when you're reading his works. That aside, if that's understood, we can now go to the analysis of some of his most brilliant works, which is Men and Techniques, a contribution to a philosophy of life. So right from the beginning, what you should try to understand is that what Spengler is trying to do with this book is to put forward a small number of questions which are interconnected and therefore suited to give us a provisional glimpse into the great secret of man's destiny. That's his own words. I'm just quoting him right now. And right from the beginning, he tries to explain the origin of this question of techniques and the relation that it has with culture. It begins in the 19th century, according to Spengler. And before that, in the 18th century, it was quite the opposite, because for him, the 18th century was the age of Robinson, Rousseau, and usually the idea of the primordial man as a peaceful, virtuous creature that we were, who would only later be corrupted by culture. The technical side of this man of the 18th century was completely overlooked. And Spengler describes this disregard for techniques and its relation to culture in terms of a very interesting dichotomy between two opposite sides. In one side, he talks about people like Goethe, the poet, who writes very, very beautiful things, but usually regarded technical matters and economic issues as something separate from culture and beneath it. And of course, that has many problems. Let's say you were a girl that was the girlfriend of Goethe or someone like him, because Goethe was a strong idealist and somehow ended up disregarding reality itself. Well, if you had some trouble with your computer or your car and you asked Goethe to help you fix your computer, Goethe would tell you many beautiful things. He would talk about the importance of God and this and that, but in the end of the day, he wouldn't solve that problem. So, of course, it's not really good when you are unable to interpret reality and solve problems that exist on it, right? But of course, as I said, it's a dichotomy. It's not just people that disregard techniques in the side of poets, but also of those that are the complete opposite of Goethe, those that are materialists, right? Those that look at art as something to be pursued quantitatively in terms of numbers, such as those that he talks about judging a historical epoch, a time, based on the number of paintings and the number of books that an author or a year produced. And of course, that is very, it's not really deep. It's a very shallow interpretation of what's happening. And at this point, we can make a very interesting connection between Spengler and another thinker of his time, who is René Guénon. Guénon was a traditionalist philosopher who was a big critic both of modernity and democracy. And for Guénon, we have a very serious problem of focusing on quantity rather than on quality. And that's the source of many modern problems. For example, in terms of democracy, we see the amount of votes rather than the actual qualities of a politician when we give him the power to lead a nation. And why is that a problem? Well, isn't it obvious? Well, you're not looking at the actual qualities of his essence, of his spirit, of his virtues. You are actually just translating the amount of votes, popularity, as if that was the most important thing, and a translation of dignity, character, strength, and so forth. Is that clear? Not just that, but even when you take a look at the numbers themselves, quantity is the shallowest depth of numbers. For people like Pythagoras, numbers were much more than just quantity. You take number one, for example, you have the concepts of unity. You take number two, you have concepts such as duality, the number three, trinity, and so on and so forth. These were interpretations that were much broader. It would take me a lot of time to explain each one of them, but I think that's a really interesting parallel between the thoughts of Guénon and Spengler, and they talk in very different terms. They were born in different places, and I'm not sure if they communicated between themselves, but they seem to diagnose the problem in different ways and seem to take approaches that are different, languages that are different, but they are going in the same direction in my take. And continuing the discussion, for Spengler, not just the focus on quantity, on art is a problem, but also the idea of utility and utility only. He deeply describes how that's terrible, and in the next video we're going to talk about the concept of utility for Spengler and how that relates to a lot of things that are happening right now, and how that's actually a sign that maybe we're actually in the decline of our civilization, in the same way that bread and circus was a symptom of a declining empire in Rome a few thousand years ago, right? And so that's an introduction to Spengler. I hope that helps some of you understand some of his thoughts. He's not as simple to read as someone that you would see it on Harvard. His references are not so simple. They require a little bit of understanding of philosophy. If you read some traditionalist thinkers, I think that really helps in understanding his cosmovision. But we're going to leave that to the next video, and I hope that sheds some light in this subject.